Tom Crandall of TR Crandall Guitars, and we thought it might be interesting for you to get a peek behind the scenes of the kind of things we encounter when we're, say, evaluating or appraising or, assessing a vintage guitar. And so we picked this one because it's particularly interesting. It's a 1934 Gibson Jumbo. Right, so Gibson's first version of a Spanish dreadnought style guitar. And, when you look at this guitar, you go, wow, cool, it's a beautiful guitar. Because I've seen so many vintage guitars, I look at this and I immediately see something awry. And what is it? Well, let's take a look at these other two guitars from 1934, which we happen to have in the shop for various reasons. You'll notice the sunburst on these. This is a Roy Smet from 1934, early one with scallop bracing, no pick guard. This is a Jumbo that's been messed with, some horribly repaired cracks, not done here. But you'll see how small that sunburst is and how it has a fairly kind of brownish hue to it. And then we look at this guitar, and we see the sunburst is much wider and much brighter. That doesn't quite add up with the time period. If you look carefully here, there's a shim under the fingerboard. So the fingerboard is thicker here than it is here. And then we look back here behind the nut, and we see a flat spot behind the nut. Normally on a Gibson guitar, this line goes right up to the nut, and the nut sits on a little flat spot just as wide as the nut. It does not go beyond. Interesting. And then if we look inside, see if we can get this with the camera. And if you look at the lining at the top alongside the neck block, you'll see how it's much shallower than the lining is on the back. So all these things add up to one conclusion. This guitar was retopped by Gibson sometime not terribly long after it was made, but in a slightly different period from its date of manufacture. If we look at how do we know the date of manufacture? Well, we look at the factory order number inside. It's 889, and we have this great book done by Joe Spann, super useful for people like us. And we look at 889, and what does it say? It says a Jumbo, 1934. So we know that this is not some weird anomaly that came out later. So here's what happened with this guitar. Something happened to the top. Very often Gibson Jumbos were braced with the X brace a little too wide and a little too close to the sound hole, and they don't support the bridge very well. So very likely what happened is this top broke and Gibson replaced it. So let's think of the process of how they would do that. They did not know how to, nobody knew how to take necks off. There was no drilling a hole or any kind of steaming involved. They would take the fingerboard off, then they would take the top off, and then they would clean everything up because little bits of lining have gotten broken off and so forth. There's some cleaning up that needs to be done on the fingerboard or where the fingerboard joins the neck. And so what we have here is we have the marks. This flat spot is carried out because this whole surface was cleaned up. And the shallower lining, and if we measure these sides compared to a regular Jumbo, you're going to find out these sides are about a 1/16 of an inch narrower, or a little less than a 1/16 of an inch narrower than you'd expect to see on a Jumbo. They would clean up that entire surface. They would glue a top over the top of the neck joint. I guarantee you if you were to try to take this neck off, you would find out that spruce goes over the top of that neck joint. And then they would put the fingerboard back on and refinish, finish the top. Very often you see, other sorts of interesting anomalies like that. Like the neck is a tiny bit narrower than you'd expect it to be because they had to clean everything up again. What does this tell us about the value of the instrument? That's really a more difficult question. It's still a 1930s Gibson. It's still a fine instrument. This instrument, like so many others, I see this on many Gibson instruments. This instrument has probably been bought and sold a number of times as all original because you look at it, you see a Gibson guitar. It looks beautiful. It looks like something similar to the period. But we have to. One of our tasks now is to sit down and decide like how much a retopped guitar is affected, how much that affects the value. We have another similar case over here of a Banner LG2. Again, this is one where the top was over the neck joint. What we do is we saw a little slit in there with a very fine razor saw, and then we break that out so that you don't crack the top on either side trying to get that neck off. And again, we have the flat spot behind the nut. It has all the classic characteristics of a guitar that was retopped by Gibson at some point. Again, this guitar was sold as all original. I'm sure many of these guitars were sold by reputable dealers. So the question that we face when we encounter this is, how much does it affect the value of the instrument? And that's really maybe an open question that I can't answer today, but we will have an answer for it at some point when we decide when this guitar goes up for sale. But point being is that it takes a good deal of experience to be able to recognize these anomalies and evaluate an instrument in a very thorough fashion. And this is something that only comes with years of experience. When this guitar came to me a number of years ago, and the owner showed it to me, and he pulled it out of the case, he said, "What do you see?" I said, "I see a retopped guitar." It was just like that. And that's very often the way we start. We see something that's a bit of an anomaly, and then you start to investigate further, and you start to be able to put together the puzzle pieces. But not everybody can do this because, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've had my hands inside so many guitars that these kinds of things are obvious to me, but not necessarily obvious to everyone else. So thank you.